Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm happy to have you here. And today we're going to be discussing on versions of marriage. Versions of marriage. You know, God established marriage. He was the initiator of marriage. The first marriage that took place in the Garden of Eden between Adam and Eve, God was the one that initiated it. And as time goes on, due to the fall of man began to derail in the principles of God, thereby creating their own version of marriage to suit their lust. So today we now have many versions of marriages in the world. But I'm going to be looking at the versions of marriage, trying to classify them into three. You know, we have many versions of marriage. Each religion, each tribe, each culture, they have their own marriage. So I'm going to try to group them into three as we look at versions of marriage today. So the first version of marriage is the original version of marriage, the one that God created. I call it Christ's version of marriage. This is the one that God created, the one initiated from the Garden of Eden, that has so many principles that was guiding it. So that's the first version. Then the second version, as I classify into three today, is the worldly kind of version, the one that man initiated on his own, the worldly type. Then the third one is the combination of the two. It's a kind of version that combines both God's original version of marriage and the one that man created. I call it mixed version. So we have original version called Christ's version. We have the worldly version. Then we now have the mixed version, which is made up of some principles from Christ's version and that of the worldly version. Now, these are the three versions of marriage that we have here today. I want to be looking at something that the version of marriage that one subscribes to determines the following things. The kind of version you subscribe to determines the following thing. It determines the spirit that follows marriage. 2, it determines the principles that guides the marriage. 3, it determines the purpose of that marriage. Then it also determines the activities that will be involved in that marriage. And finally, the results. So when you are making a choice of version of marriage to subscribe to, you have to have it in your mind that when you subscribe to a particular version, then you are subscribing to the spirit behind that version. Then that version of marriage will determine the purpose of your marriage. So you weigh the purpose of your marriage before subscribing to the version of marriage. Then you look at the principles. There are principles guiding that version of marriage. The same principle will be guiding your marriage. Then there are activities involved in that version. That is same activities you are to subscribe into. Then of course the results. So it is very important we look at this matter very well. Because like I said, like I mentioned initially, that we have three versions of marriage. You have to have understanding, depth understanding of these three versions of marriage early in your life, especially before marriage, to enable you to know, okay, what do I really want out of marriage? What do I really want out of marriage? What is the purpose? My purpose for marriage. What do I want to gain? What is the expected end of marriage, of my marriage? This is going to guide us or guide you in making decision of who to marry. Like the Christ kind of version of marriage has its own principle guiding it. Of course, the spirit behind that version is the Spirit of God, because he's the initiator. So if you're subscribing to that kind of marriage, you are guaranteed the presence of God, because he will be there to enable us, practice the principles, to enable us set the purpose and pursue it, and to enable us to, guiding us and teaching us on the activity. So the Spirit of God will also be there with you in that version of marriage. The same way in the worldly version of marriage, there are activities, there are principles that follows. You see the principles of divorce. When it's not working, just divorce, walk away. In that kind of marriage, you have selfishness. The man's ego should not be touched. The woman is doing her own. You don't expect principle of submission in worldly kind of marriage. No, it's not the principle of there. And love in its original nature is not obtainable in such marriage, because as long as I'm concerned, man cannot love when he doesn't have God. It is God in a man that produces the seed of love from that man. Do you understand me? So, but the one that is a challenge which we are passing through today in the body of Christ is the missed version of marriage, where someone, because you're a Christian, you borrow principles of Christ's marriage and borrow your culture from where you're coming from, and you miss and trying to practice the same and expect to have Christian version kind of result. This is why we are having so many challenges at home today, seeing so many families breaking, and seeing so many home children being left with a different single parents trying to raise them, and so many things are going on. We see some all kinds of quarrels and problems in the family. So when we look at this and we begin to ask ourselves this question, what version are we subscribing to? Because the version of the marriage you subscribe to should be seen in your family, should be seen in your marriage. Then when we look at your marriage by the activities that goes on there, by the principle guiding you guys, you should say this person is subscribing to this kind of version of marriage. Then when the expected time, this knowledge of version of marriage is very important to the single, to people who are single. So the singles, they need to have knowledge of the version of marriage. The first thing to check when you want to make a decision to marry a man or a woman is, apart from being born again, his purpose is to understand the version of marriage he's subscribing to. Even if the person is in church, even if the person is a minister of the gospel, is a leader in the church, you have to take the pain to find out the version is subscribing to, because that is very important. Look, there are so many good Christians that never made good spouse. Okay, many good Christians that never made good spouse. So that someone is a good leader in the church does not guarantee that he is going to be a good husband or wife. So what controls the activities, what controls the person's mindset as regard to marriage is the version he's subscribing to. Someone can be a Christian but is subscribing to the worldly kind of marriage. So before the decision of who to marry is made, it's very important to understand the person's view, the version is subscribing to, and understand whether it's in line with your own version. Let me state this: no matter how good a man is, a woman is, two of them cannot stay together as husband and wife and produce the expected result of Christ's kind of version if two of them does not subscribe. Two of them are not subscribing to God's version of marriage. So if the person is subscribing to the worldly kind of marriage and get married to a woman who is subscribing to Christ's version of marriage, there are going to be serious challenges. Because as the lady is trying, for instance, trying to practice the principle of submission in marriage, and the man is not practicing the principle of love in marriage because he doesn't have the ability, does not have the capacity to love. Only born again Christians have the capacity to love. So because it is not loving, the duty of submission is going to be very difficult for the woman. Love of a husband is like an oil that greases and make it easier for a woman to submit in marriage. So it's more difficult for a woman to submit in marriage when the needed grease is not released through the love. So it's very important for the singles to take time and study the versions of marriage and make up their mind on the one to subscribe to. Then for the married people, the knowledge of the version of marriage will help us to check our marriages and know, as Christians, are we truly subscribing to the Christ version of marriage? Or have we left the mark and start practicing the worldly version of marriage simply because we are here on earth and we are expecting Jesus to be at the center of our home? So I'm expecting that by the time we study this together, both the singles and married, as we begin to go into the principles of Christ's version of marriage, and some of these principles includes principle of oneness, principles of submission, principle of love, and so on and so forth. I'm believing that when we come together to study this, that we're going to limit, if not taking away completely, this issue of wrong marriage and broken homes. So that as we, marriage is built in knowledge. You see, it's a spiritual thing that God gives us the wisdom to practice. So as we look into these studies, as we continue in this platform, looking at these versions of marriage, looking at the principles involved in this version of marriage, for the sake of this teaching, I'll be focusing only on Christ's version of marriage. Christ's version of marriage. So the principles that I'll be discussing with us as we go on in this teaching, this platform, will be based on the principle that guides Christ's version of marriage, so that we can raise Christians who will marry like Christ, Christians whose home will be like marriage between Christ and the church. So there are so many versions of marriage. Which one do you want to subscribe into? It's better done before marriage. After marriage, it becomes difficult to reconcile the versions. I pray that God will grant us wisdom as we continue to follow us. Thank you so much. See you next time.